corollary is also true. That's why Europe is a post-Christian continent. You have state churches that get tax dollars. You have cathedrals with plaques in the back of the pews indicating corporate sponsorship to help the place. They become museum pieces, tourist destinations with very small congregations active in so many places. That's what happens when church and state come together and the state provides the funding. When religion is when we no longer have to care enough to support it financially out of our own pockets, we stop caring. The church stops being the church. Now, Ellen White, you've seen this many times, understands the shift to dragon domination in terms of the repudiation of these founding principles of our Constitution. Well, what are the Protestant principles? And see, this is so critical that we understand in context that Ellen White, when she says that Protestantism was at the foundation of our government, she doesn't mean the same thing people mean today when they talk about a Christian America. You go back, and she writes about this, chapter 11 of the Great Controversy. I believe it's chapter 11, is the protest of the princes. You go back to the origins of the Reformation. You have an actual document called a protest. Why was that issued? The Holy Roman Empire wanted to crack down on the Reformation, wanted to restrict it, wanted to enforce it among the German territories, the princes that had accepted the gospel. They wanted to restrict the preaching of the gospel geographically, and they wanted to say no new reforms. And the German princes had a pretty tough dilemma, because if they rejected the decree, it would certainly mean war. And indeed, you had how many wars in Europe that came after the Reformation between Protestant and Catholic, right? It was hundreds of years on and off of war. But they did reject the decree, and they did so because they said, in matters of conscience, the majority has no power. Now, if you think about that, the basic central teaching of the gospel, that we can enjoy a personal saving relationship with Jesus Christ by His grace through faith, means that neither the church nor the state have any right to come between us and Christ. Isn't that right? Though Noah, Daniel, and Job were in the land, each one of us gives an account to God, right? They can only save their own souls. So the early Protestants understood that protest that the princes, that gave the name Protestant to the Reformation. They understood, based on the gospel, that they couldn't compromise, that they had to follow truth wherever it would lead. That's what Ellen White means by Protestant. That the essence of these teachings, the Bible and the Bible only, by faith alone, through grace alone, the priesthood of all believers. When she says Protestantism, it's not a union of church and state. That's what the Protestants rejected. It's not Christendom. It's liberty of conscience. So we've talked about how the Christ-like aspects of our nation are often aspirational rather than realized. They are ideals that we too often fall short of, aren't they? And our early Adventist forefathers understood as early as the Spanish-American War that American imperialism was dragon-like behavior. And, of course, other forms of dragon-like behavior. So, what I want to do, I want to look at what we Adventists have come to call the threefold union. Revelation, the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. Because we see that threefold union fully formed today. Not waiting to be formed, fully formed. Okay? And I want you to get a glimpse of the thinking behind these different groups. So, just a couple of months ago, our Attorney General, who is a Catholic culture warrior, and I read a piece that he wrote in Catholic Lawyer magazine going back to 1995. So this is not, new rhetoric for him. This is deeply rooted. It has been for at least, 25 years ago that he wrote the article I read. Same idea. He gave a speech at the law school, Roman Catholic law school there at Notre Dame, just about a stone's throw from our own seminary at Andrews. Here's a couple of the points that he made. Free government is only suitable and sustainable for a religious people. Therefore, America needs religion in order for freedom to survive. So, what follows from that? That the government should promote true religion. That's a good Roman Catholic idea. The founding generation were Christians, which is simply a false premise. Therefore, America needs to be Christian. Christianity provides the right rules to live by. Well, we believe that. So our laws must reflect Christian rules. Now, here is where I see enormous danger, risk for Seventh-day Adventists. Because we are very law-based. We're very, oh, how I love thy law. It is my meditation day and night. We're very much, we believe in God's law, and we know what's right. And it's that very confidence that can get us into trouble. Why? It's one thing to believe that we know the rules to live by. It's another thing to think that we have the right to impose it on everybody else. And let me give you some food for thought here. Exodus 21. When Moses is up on the mountain receiving the commandments and the laws of God, the 10 Commandments are given to him as recorded in chapter 20, right? And so the very next chapter, God begins to give him the rest of the laws. And the first subject that you will encounter, if you turn to Exodus 21, is the subject of slavery. Now, I'm sorry, but, no blasphemy or disrespect meant, but God got it wrong. Because we have superior moral knowledge now in the 21st century, and we know that there is no room for slavery in civilized society. It is an absolute evil. We know that. So God, why did you permit slavery in Israel? Chapter 21, there are laws to, dare I say, humanize or civilize the institution of slavery, but he doesn't banish it. But surely, God, you know that slavery is an unmitigated evil, don't you? We know that. And where did we get that knowledge from? You must have given it to us. So I ask you, why did God not require a moral absolute of Israel? He adapted moral absolutes to the social conditions of the day. Do you see that? So, if he's our example, I would suggest to you that it's much easier for the church to discern theologically, biblically, how we as Christians should strive to live in harmony with God's will. Much more difficult to determine how to apply those moral principles in a diverse, pluralistic society. I have been a bit of an agnostic on the subject of abortion law. Not on the subject of abortion, mind you. I'm an Adventist. I believe what we believe. There's my girl. Hey, Janice. Welcome. Got to call you out if you're going to come in late.
Sorry.
And you get, seeing your smile, you're going to put a smile on my face. Always.
They fed me where I was, so
Of course. Absolutely. Absolutely. Janice Warden-Washington is the only member of our Narla West board that I haven't introduced you all to, but everybody who was here this morning saw you on the video. So, I'm an agnostic on the law of abortion, but not on the morality of abortion. It's much easier to know, how I want to live and how I want my family to live than, how we should structure society. And I've talked to a lot of Christians who are very staunch pro-life activists, and they are not clear on, well, if we overturn Roe v. Wade, then, what are we going to do with the law? How harsh are we going to get? Are we going to put doctors in prison if they if they conduct abortions? Are we going to put mothers in prison? What are we going to do? And there's no real consensus. My point is, it's a lot easier for us to understand Bible teachings and how they apply to us. But Catholicism is of the view that because Christianity provides the right rules to live by, the society's laws have to come into line with Christian rules. But that wasn't even true for Israel when God Himself gave the law. And last, the secular elites are trying to destroy Christianity, waging war on religion, and we must fight back. You know where there has been the most explosive growth of the church globally in the last generation? No, just Christianity generally. One of the places, I don't have statistics on this, as far as number one, but one of the top countries in the world where the church is in explosive growth is also one of the most oppressive countries in the world, China. The idea that Christianity requires an hospitable culture and legal structure in order to thrive is not supported by history. Isn't that true? Now, there is some truth to the idea that there are secular elites that are trying to change Christianity. I've talked to some for example, who are quite determined to change the beliefs and practices of the church with respect to human relationships, in particular marriage. So it's not that Barr is completely, out to lunch here, but his conclusion that somehow our fight is a political fight, that's simply wrong-headed, isn't it? Our fight, we wrestle not against principalities and powers. No, our battle is a spiritual battle. So, some of you, I know, have read the book, The Keys of This Blood, and I hear echoes of that analysis here in Bill Barr's speech. Only the truth has rights, and the church is the one that is the authority that defines what is truth. And of course, I should have put another bullet point here that the state then has an obligation to uphold the truth as defined by the church. Right? That's the Roman Catholic view. Now, you can see that philosophy and how that is consistent with the mark of the beast, right? That traditional Roman Catholic view. And I don't go in for anything that smacks of bigotry, Catholic bashing, whatever. Dealing with issues. The fact is, Jesus says, other sheep I have that are not of this fold, right? So if we apply that to ourselves, that means that there are other sheep in other Christian folds besides Adventism. And in fact, there is only one body of Christ. And so there are people of all different doctrinal persuasions that still love Jesus and are saved by his grace, even though, we're all like the blind men seeing different aspects of the elephant. Fair enough? So let's take a look at the Protestant version, because a threefold union, you have the beast represented by Catholicism, the false prophet representing Protestant America, and spiritualism. We're going to get to spiritualism in a minute. So, Calvinism. We have the truth, we're the elect, we know the will of God, we have the right to rule. And the rest of you folks, you don't count. Now, add the prosperity gospel to Calvinism, and this is a deadly brew. It is a bad mixture. You know that that Trump's pastor is Paula White, right? You've been watching her. Well, she is both a proponent of the prosperity gospel and a Pentecostal, right? Very much Pentecostal. So, the prosperity gospel would say, well, we're in power because God is blessing us. We're powerful and wealthy because of God's blessing. And you guys are out of power because you're of the devil. And when you fight against us, you are enemies of God. You heard Trump, or you heard about Trump saying in that Spanish megachurch in Florida in January, God is on our side, right? I haven't given, well, I gave my disclaimer last night. I'll give it differently today. I'm not interested in talking politics, in talking political parties, in telling anybody how to vote, okay? That's, this is not a, beat up on Donald Trump session, okay? I want to look at what's happening in the religious world. That's my point. You know, I don't care who you vote for, et cetera. That's not what this is about. So I just want to be clear on that, because it can be so hard these days for us to hear one another if we're saying it a little differently than we like to hear it. And, you know, I hope we can hear. So, what we see in this deadly brew goes back historically to the contrast between the Puritan folks who came over from England and our founding fathers. Because the Puritans were very much about setting up the shining city upon a hill, right? And they created religious establishments. They had public financing of religion. They had religious tests for public office. They excluded religious dissenters. There were some Quakers who were hung in Massachusetts, not a lot. They ran Roger Williams out of Massachusetts. There was a certain amount of persecution in Puritan New England because it was very much a my way or the highway. This is, you know, God's commonwealth. Massachusetts is still a commonwealth, right? Now, by the time we get to the Founding Fathers, America had experienced the First Great Awakening. And the result of the First Great Awakening was an explosion of religious diversity. You had Baptists, you had Methodists, and you had all different stripes of Anglican and Congregational, and you know, you had the Dutch Reform, and you had German. You had such a mixture that it was very clear that you couldn't have any one group be the dominant religion, and the state couldn't favor religion. But they went much further than that. Pluralism certainly was a factor, but they rejected religious establishments, and not just at the federal level, they rejected it at each state level as well. And they understood that religion is not the business of government. And so they would protect, for the first time, religious freedom for everybody. And by the way, they were quite conscious that that was not just religious freedom for Christians. It was also for Jews, you know, and at the time, it was a predominantly Protestant culture, but it also meant religious freedom for Catholics and even for Muslims. And it was quite intentional that the treaty that John Adams signed, that was drafted by the Washington administration with Tripoli, proclaimed that America is not in any sense founded upon the Christian religion. It wasn't. It was founded to be a place of freedom for everyone, right? Because religion, the Protestant concept is religion is voluntary. So the state's not going to force you to pay tax dollars to support religion. Not going to tell you you have to go to church or you can't go to church. It's going to just protect religion and religious freedom. So what we have with Christian nationalism today is a revival of Puritanism. I want to say about 20 years ago, I don't remember the exact date, it was either late, maybe it was 30, it was late 80s or early 90s. One of the lead organizations that, you know, Christian political groups, very Calvinist, published this book, and I have a choice quote from George Grant's book here that explains the ethos of what they're trying to do. And you have to understand, this is not like a speech at a rally. This is not just an expression of enthusiasm. This is something that was carefully thought out and published, edited, etc. Christians have an obligation, a mandate, a commission, a holy responsibility to reclaim the land for Jesus Christ, to have dominion. So another word for this is dominionism, to have dominion in the civil structures, just as in every other aspect of life and godliness. World conquest. That's what Christ has commissioned us to accomplish. Now, I read in Matthew 28 about what we come to call the Great Commission. And it's not about world conquest in any political sense, is it? It's about sharing the gospel, teaching people about Jesus. The quote goes on to explain that Christian politics has as its primary intent, okay, lay it out. What is it all about? What are the Paula Joneses and the Jerry Falwell Jr.'s and the Pat Robertsons? What are these folks all about? The conquest of the land, of men, families, institutions, bureaucracies, courts, and governments for the kingdom of Christ. It is to reinstitute the authority, there's that exousia again, the authority of God's word as supreme over all judgments, legislation, declarations, constitutions, and confederations. And if you want to know what that looks like, there's, I want to say, a 3-volume set, The Institutes of Biblical Law by R.J. Rushdoony, the philosopher, theologian, and architect of this entire school of thought. And he lays out in great detail which crimes we should reinstitute the death penalty for, etc. Yes, sir?
That sounds like militant Islam.
Prophetically, Seventh-day Adventists have 2 competing versions of who the king of the south might be in Daniel 11. Militant Islam is one, and there's certainly a lot of evidence for that. Militant atheism is another. At various times, I've believed either one. I don't know, Steve, if you have a different take or if you favor one or the other, but I think those are the 2 prominent concepts within Adventism. But the prophecy says that the king of the south pushes at the king of the north. The king of the north triumphs, wipes them out. So whether it's atheism, whether it's Islam, either way, it is corrupt Christianity, this threefold union of Protestantism, Catholicism, and spiritualism that will dominate. That will dominate even more than the 49ers are going to trounce Kansas City tomorrow. My son would say, from your lips to God's ears. I'm actually not a Niners fan, but my family are. So I may watch some of the game. We'll see. What's that? We're brothers anyway. All right. So I shared this quote this morning from Desire of Ages because I think the contrast here is so profound. Here it's talking about, world conquest and establishing the kingdom of Christ. And Ellen White says, yeah, there are those multitudes who believe they're working for the establishment of the kingdom of Christ as an earthly and temporal dominion. They want to make our Lord the ruler of the kingdoms of this world in its courts, camps, legislative halls, etc. And they expect Christ to rule through legal enactments enforced by human authority. Read through them, right? Since Christ is not now here in person, they themselves will undertake to act in his stead to execute the laws of his kingdom. And this is what She says the Jews wanted, the Jewish leaders wanted. They would have received Jesus had he been willing to establish a temporal dominion to enforce what they regarded as the laws of God, make them the expositors of his will. Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. Right? So this whole endeavor to take biblical law, to take the moral rules that we value and make them the law of the land, it's wrong-headed. But Adventists are at risk. Why? Because our values and our beliefs are pretty much the same. And so, when we see politically, well, you got a choice between one party and the other, and one party is, wanting to uphold marriage and oppose abortion and, what have you, we're like, yeah, well, that's the side I'm on. And I'm not saying, don't vote your conscience or whatever. I'm just saying keep your eyes open. That the game for us is not about getting our rules to govern. And that it's too easy to get sucked in emotionally and lose our perspective as Adventists. That's what I'm saying. Does that make sense? So Christian nationalism, from a Protestant standpoint, sees America founded with the purpose of being a Christian nation. Well, that vision of a Christian nation is somewhat narrow. It's not just that the laws should favor the Christian religion, but it's a Christian nation primarily for white Northern European folks. It's not an inclusive version of a Christian nation. And as I explained in my history lesson this morning, the driving force between uniting Protestants and Catholics was racism, not abortion. Abortion has become the kind of way to move forward. But that wasn't what brought them together. Now, honestly, Christian nation is an oxymoron. It is. And the fact is, it's that too. But the fact is, nobody wants the nation to be Christian. We don't want the nation to live according to the Sermon on the Mount, for crying out loud. We don't want the nation to turn the other cheek. Nobody wants America to actually behave in a Christ-like manner. Nations don't have a soul to save. To be Christian means to have, as Protestants, we believe it means to have a saving relationship with Jesus Christ, which is something that only human beings can have, not nations, right? Now, so the whole concept of a Christian nation, of a Christian America, harkens back to the Middle Ages and what came to be known as Christendom. And the reason that Martin Luther compromised on the subject of baptism, because his rejection of adult baptism was not Bible-based. I've read some history on this, and there's some evidence that he knew that he was on shaky ground biblically, but in order to maintain social and political order, it became politically expedient that everybody get baptized and that he maintain some semblance of Christendom, albeit in a Protestant form. Which is why it took a couple hundred years for Protestantism to come to America to actually then work out the political implications of these foundational beliefs. To remove itself a step away from Christendom to where, yeah, we had all these different beliefs and groups and this pluralism, to where we could finally discover what it means to implement these values of religious freedom and rights of conscience. So it took a while for Protestantism to work itself out politically, but that's very different from the idea of Christendom and this Christian nationalism. Early last year, there was a meeting at the Trump Hotel. This is a report from a left-wing critic of Christian nationalism, Fred Clarkson. I've interviewed him several times on my radio show. Christian dominionists meet at Trump's Washington hotel to answer the divine call to war. We Adventists generally have very little exposure to Pentecostalism, most of us, unless you came out of Pentecostalism. We don't necessarily really get what it's all about. Fred writes, "It's no small thing when the living God, speaking through his apostles and prophets, is calling for enforcing kingdom rule and raising up an army of special forces." So understand that this is Pentecostalism meeting with prosperity gospel and Calvinism in the form of this Christian dominionism. And why did they choose Trump Hotel? I didn't put the fact that it was at Trump's hotel here to, be a sneaky, dig at Trump. There's a reason why they were at Trump's hotel, right? Because they're dominionists. And that's the whole point, is their proximity to power. Now, understand that they are engaged in a form of spiritual warfare. And when Paula White gets up at the rally in South Florida where Trump says God is on our side, and she calls out Trump's enemies as enemies of God, as of the devil, this is spiritual warfare. This is the third part of the threefold union. And you can see that the passion that is aroused and the conviction that, it's not just that we are doctrinally right. It's not just that God is objectively blessing us because we have power and wealth. It's that we have the Spirit and the endorsement of God Himself. And that kind of conviction is extraordinarily dangerous. But that's where we are today. The threefold union is fully formed and it's in power. Now, we were talking at the lunch table, America goes through cycles. We go through swings. Like I said last night, my dog knocked my crystal ball off and broke it. So, oh well. I don't know if we're on, like the final pendulum swing and, what's going to happen. I don't have tomorrow's newspaper or next year's newspaper. If I did, I'd make a killing in the markets, right? All I can do is a risk assessment and keep my eyes open and see what it is that we're looking at here. That's all we can do. We shared this quote this morning that the grasp for political power is a clear sign that the church has lost the power of grace and the power of love. The secret of all persecution. When the church begins to seek for the support of secular power, it's evident she is devoid of the power of Christ, the constraint of divine love. So, I talked about this morning in the sermon. What I want to do here and then have our panel, there are some very thoughtful, responsible Christian leaders who have spoken out. And they put together a statement, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. I signed the statement. Let's read it and see the extent to which we can say amen to the values that it expresses. As Christians, our faith teaches us everyone is created in God's image and commands us to love one another. Amen? As Americans, we value our system of government and the good that can be accomplished in our constitutional democracy. Amen? Today, we are concerned about a persistent threat to both our religious communities and our democracy, Christian nationalism. Well, let's see how it explains this. Christian nationalism seeks to merge Christian and American identities, distorting both the Christian faith and America's constitutional democracy. Christian nationalism demands Christianity be privileged by the state and implies that to be a good American, one must be Christian. Is that true? That we have to be Christian to be a good American? It often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. And I like the moderate way that's stated. It's not saying that all Christian nationalists are racist, okay? But it's saying that there is a considerable amount of overlap there. And that's certainly true. We've seen that, as in Charlottesville, right? We reject this damaging political ideology and invite our Christian brothers and sisters to join us in opposing this threat to our faith and to our nation. As Christians, we are bound to Christ, not by citizenship, but by faith. And so here it states the beliefs. We believe people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. Is that true? Patriotism does not require us to minimize our religious convictions. Well, that's certainly true. One's religious affiliation or lack thereof should be irrelevant to one's standing in the civic community. You're not a second-class citizen if you're a Jew or if you're a non-believer. Is that right? Government should not prefer one religion over another or religion over non-religion. That's the genius of the Establishment Clause. Religious instruction is best left to our houses of worship, other religious institutions like religious schools, and families, right? We don't need the state trying to teach our kids what to believe. Talked about that here many times. America's historic commitment to religious pluralism enables faith communities to live in civic harmony with one another without sacrificing our theological convictions. We can live together with Catholics and Mormons and Jews and Muslims and everybody. We can live together in civic harmony, can we not? Conflating religious authority with political authority is idolatrous. I made that point this morning, I think, and often leads to oppression of minority and other marginalized groups, as well as the spiritual impoverishment of religion. Well, that was really the subject of my sermon this morning, is conflating religious authority with political authority. We must stand up to and speak out against Christian nationalism, especially when it inspires acts of violence and intimidation, including vandalism, bomb threats, arson, hate crimes, attacks on houses of worship, against religious communities at home and abroad. And I would say we need to stand up and speak out, not just when it becomes violent. Whether we worship at a church, mosque, synagogue, or temple, America has no second-class faiths. All are equal under the U.S. Constitution. As Christians, we must speak in one voice, condemning Christian nationalism as a distortion of the gospel of Jesus and a threat to American democracy. I think that was extremely well crafted, which is why, I rarely sign my name to anything, but I couldn't find anything to quibble over in that statement. I was able to wholeheartedly support it. So at this time, Lincoln, if Lincoln and Dennis and Janice, why don't you join us as well, if you would, and we're going to go ahead and open up for the panel and see where the discussion takes us. You know, what sorts of topics and issues you're interested in finding out about. So we've got 3 chairs here. I guess we're going to need at least one more. Yeah. How did we do time-wise there? Was that really a whole hour? I was trying to keep it shorter than that.
As we're getting situated up here, we'll just move the pulpit off to the side. I wanted to say that this morning's presentation and this one this afternoon has been one of the best I've ever heard. What do you say? It was really right on the target. I'm going to ask Janice. She doesn't know this. We've worked together for quite a while. Tell us what you've done in Sacramento. We saw your support of Religious Liberty Magazine, but tell us what you've done.
Hey, you know, it's been a blessing to really be able to partner with the gentleman you see here on the pulpit, and because of being able to interface with them, continues to allow me to have, I think, the mission to just be able to not be ashamed of the word that God has given us, and to truly, with the theme this year, to be able to be a witness. And so any opportunity I'm given to be able to talk about why this is the time for us to really advocate for religious freedoms, I'm not ashamed to do so. And even though working at the state capitol, there are some nuances there because, yes, it's the state capitol, and so I can't just openly walk around with, you know, just spitting it out from the hallways of the Capitol, but God has been able to bless me to be able to be an influencer with the role He's given me, where throughout the time of being able to develop relationships, I know something Sir Dennis will probably talk about, that has been a blessing to be able to then, as I'm developing those relationships, to be able to talk about why our faith. I'll stop there. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but.
All right. Well, come sit here with us.
So basically, the work of religious liberty is not just to advocate for what we want, but it's all about developing relationships, even with the liberal left,
Chatting with you for just
because you never know down, in the future when you may need them. When we lobby in various capitals, we don't go in there like the paid lobbyists to try to twist arms and say, if you don't vote for what we want, we're going to rise up or whatever. You know, we fight for the religious freedoms of all people, not just our own faith. And we're there to make relationships and to acquaint them with these principles that Alan has talked about. So I've always viewed my work whenever I've done legislative work, look at it as an opportunity to witness for God. And that's what Denise was talking about.
Amen.
So just before we get into our panel, I want to have Dennis give just a quick overview, because we'll probably forget it at the end, of what's happening in Sacramento. Some of the kind of the big issues that we're facing. Just not specific details, but just kind of the big picture of what's happening in Sacramento.
Well, the interesting thing this year, amongst all of the stakes that... The interesting thing this year is that so far, California doesn't have the worst bills that have to do with Christian institutions, which is kind of nice. But Hawaii has quite a few bills that are related to clergy that have to do with mandated reporting and things of that nature. We've got in Arizona the same mandated reporting. It's not just one bill, it's like 4 or 5 bills. So those things are coming up. For the Seventh-day Adventist Church, that's not a huge issue, because all of our pastors are already mandated reporters. But we do have to really think about the issues of conscience and how we look at it. But what we're finding in terms of an overview of what's happening with legislation this year is that we're looking at opportunities to positively support, not positively, to support various different forms of the various different bills in the different states in order to create relationships with the elected officials, so that as things do pop up, that we are able to have these relationships already built. So we didn't send out any bills, or we have not sent out any bills to the church, or to the churches so far. We don't know what Janice is going to slip in here past us. But we'll find out.
So I want to pick up with just a general introduction. You'll be thinking of the questions that you want to ask based on last night's presentation. This is based on Alan's talk, but let me quote the First Amendment, then I have a couple of questions. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Our Christian right believers say that when it talks about an establishment of religion, they're talking about establishing a state-sponsored church. So you historians, tell us what our founding fathers meant when they said no establishment or support of religion. What did they mean by the word religion? I think, we hear the First Amendment quoted all the time, but we don't really understand what some of these words mean. So anybody on the panel, Alan?
All right. So when I was a kid, there were two words that we loved to say. They were the longest words that we knew. One of them came out of Mary Poppins. Remember what that one was? Right. And the other one was anti-disestablishmentarianism. You remember that? So I had no clue what it meant. I'm not going to try to explain it now, but it has to do with one side or the other of dealing with religious establishments. It wasn't until I got to an undergraduate history thesis on the First Amendment that I went back and I looked at the history. Well, what did our founding fathers mean by the term establishment? That was the key, because they're using the term in it's a word we're familiar with. We may talk about, a restaurant establishment or, whatever. We use it in different ways today. It was used very differently back then, and we may think we know what it means. The best way to understand it is to see what the history in colonial America was. So you had places like New England where you only had one type of established church. You had the congregational churches that were Puritan, that were Calvinist, and they enjoyed broad funding and support. You had licensing of clergy, right? There were also, within the licensing of clergy, the Baptists got into trouble because, in many places, they didn't have what we called settled clergy. They had itinerant preachers, but they were only licensed for a certain area. So when they'd go riding their horse town to town, they might wind up getting arrested and put in jail. Famously, James Madison listened to a couple of Baptist preachers preaching from behind bars there in the jail in Orange, Virginia, not far from where Heartland College is located. There were many different types of establishments. You had places like New York where you had both the Dutch Reformed Church and the Anglican Church, the English and the Dutch in New York, both enjoyed special privileges. Okay, so you had a number of states where you had multiple establishments. But, it all involved some kind of legal structure regulating and providing financial support for religion generally, Christian religion in particular, whether it was a single denomination or multiple denominations. That's what was meant by establishment. So when the First Amendment said no law respecting an establishment of religion, that was extremely broad and inclusive language. We're not going to have any establishments anymore. Now, granted, the battle initially was at the federal level. We're doing a federal constitution. It doesn't tell the states what to do, it tells the federal government what to do. The problem with Justice Thomas's view that the states are free to establish religion is all the states banished their own establishments around the same time, because that was the genius and the thinking of that generation was to get rid of religious establishments. And then when the Congress enacted the Civil War amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments at the end of the Civil War, they were very deliberately intending to insist that the states now cannot violate fundamental rights of its citizens, including African Americans. But ironically, even though blacks were granted the right to vote, who was not yet considered as being included in those all-encompassing rights to be enforced against the states. And it took another, 60 years before women's suffrage. What other issue? Well, that's true. Women are still not equal to men in our Constitution.
Go ahead, go for it.
Anyway, so that's the whole deal with establishment. The idea was to simply eliminate the role of government in religion.
I add a little bit to that. There's no question that as the American Revolution got underway, there was a strong reaction against England and its ways, and automatically they established the Church of England, which Puritans in this country. I'm always ragging on about the Civil War in England. That was also a civil war that was fought against an established church by the new phenomenon of Puritanism, which was sort of a free religion. It wasn't structurally, it wasn't very well structured and certainly not governmental supported. But to bring it to the future, it's not that long ago, I was listening to the Supreme Court discussing this, and I could not believe they were joking and riffing among themselves, and they got into discussing whether it was right for the state to pay for the building of a church of a particular religion. And it went round and round, and in the end, they all agreed and laughed that as long as all churches were built with government monies, it would be fine. I mean, I can't think of a better illustration of where we've come than that. I just don't think they have a built-in firewall against.
No, they don't. And they're not thinking. Because the first time that the Church of Scientology applies for the grant, everybody's going to have smoke coming out of their ears.
And then to go back to what shared before about this new Christian nationalism, there's a great irony because that's what the framers were rejecting. Up until that point, especially through the wars of religion in Europe, the mainline religion was automatically equated with being whatever the country of the nationality was. You were Lutheran, you were the expectation of a German.
The religion of the people was
Right.
the religion
So
of
we're
the
going
prince.
back to it. Again, talk about the wheel of history. There's nothing new under the sun, said someone in the Bible, Solomon. A not so wise man, but he did figure that out. And we are on a wheel of history that's turning back, and they've forgotten along the way some of the inhibitions that gave rise. And again, we got to be honest. The Christian right are manipulating history. The vast majority of these leading lights in the American War of Independence were not religious. You can be generous with them and call them deists. They were, many of them, more obviously interested in Masonry, the order, Masonic orders. It was expedient for them to talk religion. That was sort of the general cultural idea, but they had no particular burden to favor religion. And some of their private dialogues, and I'm always quoting the one between Jefferson and Adams in the last days. Adams was a bit more positive. Jefferson didn't even think Christianity would survive in this country. Thankfully it has. But we have to realize that it was a very strong secular movement that established this country. It had a respect for religion, and in that mechanism, I think God was working through it. But I just don't like sanctifying the whole American experiment too much to start with. This was a thoroughly secular outgrowth of the Enlightenment, and it was carried forward by the openness of thinking that the Reformation had enabled.
Well said.
Just so we don't go too far past what Alan was talking about with the suffragettes. We're going to come back to that for just a second. There seemed to be a little bit of a discussion within the suffragettes as to what they wanted to do, whether they felt that they wanted to go for women and the vote, or whether they wanted to go for a constitutional amendment that would make women equal to men or the same as men under the Constitution. So, in case you don't know, you're not equal to us. You're meaning the females in this group.
Legally.
Well, we kind of, yeah, we say that, but oftentimes it's more than just, yeah. But just this, in the last 2 to 4 weeks, I don't remember exactly how long it's been, Virginia became the 38th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment that was set out almost somewhere between 30 and 40 years ago. Sent out to the states to be ratified, and then that would then produce a constitutional amendment that would make women, would make women equal to men under the Constitution. So now there's going to be another problem. So because of the way Congress is set up right now, it's unlikely that they'll allow that to happen. And so they're going to send it on, but we'll see what happens. But to me, that seems to be fairly problematic. God didn't make, from my perspective, God didn't make one group of people less than another group of people. And so I think
Dennis, I was listening to a broadcast about the history of the ERA, and they pointed out, Phyllis Schlafly almost single-handedly defeated it. And one of her main arguments was that the Equal Rights Amendment would inevitably require, women in the military, got that long ago, and same-sex marriage. So, it almost seems like, we may not think that same-sex marriage should be legal, but it surely is no longer a rationale for depriving women of equality under the law.
Some people have talked to me about how that might affect the Seventh-day Adventist Church and where we stand on women in ordination. The interesting thing is that New Jersey has had not only New Jersey, Utah, have had for generations an equal rights amendment within their state. So women in those states have the same status as men do, which is the important thing about that, as far as I can see, is that as long as women are not considered equal in states, then those states can create laws that could be discriminatory against women, but are at least different than what they're doing for men. So
All right,
it seems
but
unfair.
the reality is, last night I talked about where the court is going in the wrong direction in terms of denigrating religious freedom or changing things and harming religious freedom. But they also are at risk of going too far the other way on certain issues, and this is one of them. It's been clearly established that courts are not going to meddle with the relationship between a religious body and its clergy. It's something that is founded in the First Amendment. It's called the ministerial exception. So, if Elder Graham decides that, he wants to fire me because I'm a Jew and he doesn't like Jews, I have no recourse, right? As a minister, it's perfectly legitimate to, quote, discriminate. The courts aren't going to second guess. If a Korean pastor in New York, David, wanted to pastor, North Bronx Church, and it's a West Indian church, and the president said, Korean pastor, West Indian church, that's not a good fit. The Korean pastor does. Now, the case that the Supreme Court took is a case that a friend and colleague of mine won in the lower courts, including the Ninth Circuit, a case called Beale. There are actually 2 cases involving Roman Catholic elementary school teachers. one of whom is Catholic, the other is not Catholic. They have discrimination claims, and those who are bringing the case to the Supreme Court are arguing that these teachers should be considered ministers, protected, so that the church, the school can fire them at will and discriminate against them, because the courts shouldn't sit in judgment of those who are considered ministers and responsible for teaching the faith. Well, it's true that both of them are required to teach a catechism class, but one of them's not even Catholic, and she's just teaching the curriculum, right? So they don't have to believe it in order to teach it. They don't have to model it. They just have to teach the curriculum. If the court goes this far, there are some of us in the Religious Liberty Department who are absolutely up in arms against this and quite dissenting. And I will tell you, as someone who litigates cases, that what's going to happen is judges are going to ignore it. If they don't like it, they won't apply it, and it will just run up the cost of some of these claims.
This is an interesting aspect. I hadn't heard you comment on this before. But I love history, and it's worth remembering back. Anyone remember or heard in their school days of Thomas à Becket and Henry II?
Of course.
That was over church prerogatives, not just on religious matters, on civil matters. And then very few people seem to have noticed that when Henry VIII, concerned a bit more than which wife he had and progeny, but he was most troubled at the church prerogatives. There were civil courts and church courts. The church property was exempt from taxation. And a big part of the Reformation in England was to nip the church authority in the bud, which was clearly over the top. And I've been worried, even as we're pushing all the time, some of the sweeping exemptions granted to the church that you mentioned, fire and fire, really without the responsibility the secular organizations have. That's fine to a point when we think the church should be left alone, but it's creating this dual legal track, in my view, that other churches or seculars will find seriously offensive. And I don't know how it's going to work out, but I have this nagging suspicion that the ever-enlarging Roman Catholic sex abuse scandal is going to pour out from under these exemptions, which could be very bad for our church in the autonomy that we largely have in this country. And even some of the discussion I hear where we're protecting our tax exemption is fine. I like on my tax to get a little bit of benefit for after I paid the tithe, but it's a double-edged sword. And even recently, we've been sponsoring a bill to protect our rights vis-a-vis gay rights. And pretty much said it nakedly there. Not us, but we bought into it, that we reserve the right to discriminate against gays in our church operation. It's offensive to non-religionists or people that don't share our faith view. So I don't know where the middle ground is, but I know historically the churches went over it, and we need to be careful now. And the religious right now are pushing, I often call it religious entitlement. They're pushing for more and more rights for their particular view of religion. And yes, we know the end game where there's going to be, as Alan outlined very well, a moralistic sort of a pseudo-Old Testament theocracy here. But it may not be smooth sailing all the way, and they're likely to get strong kickback both from other religions who are missing out and from secularists who legitimately under the US secular construct will say, why should our money go towards supporting, or why should we have a different justice than is given to church operations?
Janice, I would like to put you on the spot for a minute and get a report, kind of what's the larger view of what's going on in Sacramento and the legislature. I know that 2 years ago, in a big way, to some extent last year, the whole Me Too movement has been a really big issue. We passed, was it Senate Bill 1300, which was a major bill dealing with sexual harassment. Are there any particular themes or big issues that you're seeing here in California in the legislature this year?
Some of them, I think, well, I have the mindset that almost any touch point, we can find a way to see how it's, relevant to religious liberty, because as we know, it's not just about not taking a test on Sabbath or working on Sabbath. But I would say the issue with the Me Too movement, that is still something that is resonating at the Capitol. There's still, even with the legislation that was passed and the whole cultural shift, if you will, and putting more things in place to protect the members and the staff, there's still allegations that are floating out there, and dealing with people not necessarily releasing all the information would. So there's that happening. I think one of the things that are really trending, which we really get around, is just homelessness, which I know just recently, but January 10, the governor released his January proposal for the budget for the 2020-2021 year. And unlike anything I can recall all of my times working at the legislature, a huge percentage of the proposed budget, which is $333 billion, a good percentage of that is really to try to look at how he can tackle how the state can tackle the homelessness issue. And I think there's even something there that we can try to figure out, how do we partner, because we don't want to see homeless people anymore than anyone else. And I think if we don't partner, sometimes then we're all working in silos, and then we defeat the good, because no one's coming up together to have a solution that could really make a change. So that's something that's really big. We're also seeing that, well, there was a bill last year, I don't remember the bill number, but it was in the Senate, and Friday was the deadline for any bills that were introduced last year to be able to get to the second House of Origin to still be alive in the 2-year legislative session. So another one dealing with how do we address the housing issues. It failed on the Senate floor twice this week. And what I thought was very telling was the pro tem of the Senate. She literally made a speech before they gavelled down, and pretty much threatened that she's wanting the people to get it together, because she said, whether you like it or not, there will be a bill that's passed. It's unfortunate it's not this one, because I think this was the one most balanced. I'm paraphrasing. And I thought that was telling, because you don't usually see that with leadership, where they're basically saying to their colleagues, get it together, because normally they allow them to vote their conscience. So I think that is where we're going to see some interesting changes, because it was kind of a threat saying, look, this is going to pass, so whatever you need to do to be comfortable voting for it, you have until the end of August, when it's the end of the session, to be comfortable. But she said the issue is not going away, and the way that the particular bill, a lot of people had concerns, thus it failed, even though it's trying to address a positive issue.
The one that I heard on public radio had to do with requiring cities and towns to build housing near transportation hubs. Yep. Was that?
That's the one. Yes, yeah. That is the one.
And the cities wanted more local control.
The cities wanted more local control, and that's where it's interesting, because while I'm thankful that I can really more so focus on the policy of different things in my role, and my major emphasis at the Capitol is higher education, I'm thankful I can focus more so on the policies, but this is an example where politics plays a role, because the bill failed twice, and they really were trying to see if they could have the votes, and I know the pro tem was really working the angle, and even though she's not the author of the bill, and I think that's where those that really still had concerns were able to talk to those members, and they felt was best, but that could change.
You did.
Yeah, I mean, and there are other issues, but I would say right now where that touch point is, where we have, I think, an opportunity to rally around, would definitely be this homeless and housing issue. And there are so many other issues. Pension reform and prison reform, and there's just a lot.
Okay, Janice opened a door. So right now we've been talking about religious liberty. So Alan has reminded me often, a couple of times, that the department is really called PARL, which is Public Affairs and Religious Liberty. And so that gives us an opportunity to do something. When I say us, I mean you, and me, and Janice, and Alan. But we can leave out Lincoln because he doesn't live here, and Gary. However, we
He
do have
talks funny.
the stuff that's on the federal side that we could be affected as this as well. But the idea that we have an opportunity to affect our communities from the PARO perspective, public affairs. And I've been talking to this body now for several years about how we can get involved. And I talked to you, I think, last year about Patty. Well, I'm going to give you an update now because it's making a difference. And I'm going to preface what I'm going to start to say by numbers are not important, but they're fun. Whether 2 people show up or 10 people show up, it's not how many show up, it's the ones that God brought there. So I said that first. Okay, so Patty did come to me. She wanted to get involved. She has been getting involved. The homeless issue, okay, she has been involved with the County of Los Angeles and with a city council member, which, fascinating enough, is his father used to be the pastor of one of the churches in Southern California. And he has a passion for homelessness. And so Patty has found a way to partner with him. So one of the churches down there in Southern California now has opened up their parking lot and has partnered with the city of Los Angeles and the county to have a place where homeless can come and take a shower, find out what's available in the community that the county and the city offer. And so now that church is becoming a place that is a beacon for helping homeless people. Patty has been visiting her federal elected officials, and she has been talking to them about a separation of church and state. She's talking about how we can partner, what can we do. The chief of staff suggested that at some point that the congressman or congresswoman would come to a church in Southern California for a town hall meeting. So she got a call, and the chief of staff said, we've got the right place, we've got the right time, we've got the right issue. We just need a neutral place for a town hall meeting in Compton. So Patty called me, and I said, you need to call the religious liberty director for the conference. He found a church. They were looking for a building that would sit 200 people. Now, if 200 people came to an Adventist church anywhere, that would be really great. When Patty showed up on on the night of the town hall meeting, I don't know when it was, there were 5 news outlets, 2 in Spanish, 3 in English.
Television cameras,
What's that?
TV cameras.
TV cameras, yes. And they more than filled up what probably would have held 200 in the fellowship hall. Over 1,000 people showed up. Now, you want to know what the issues are? You'll never guess. Well, somebody might. Potholes in Compton. Potholes. I mean, I said, what? Potholes are really, really a big issue, apparently, because it was taking first responders minutes more, or sometimes more than minutes, to get to people who were having medical issues, domestic violence issues, all kinds of different issues. Well, what do you do with 1,000 people? Actually, more than 1,000, according to the pastor, because it was standing room only. Well, they've accommodated them in the church. They had 1,000 people that were angry about potholes, and it got a little bit tense. And there was no security for the congresswoman, and there was a big person. Patty said he was bigger than me, and I took that as a compliment. And he started coming towards the congresswoman. The pastor, who comes up just under my shoulders, stood between that person and the congresswoman and looked that person in the eye that was coming down the aisle and said, "This is a house of God. We've invited the community in, and we expect that you will respect our church." And the place broke out in clapping. And the guy sat down. There was no incident. And as people were going out, there were a number, I don't know how many. They stopped by the pastor and said, "We've lived here all of our lives and we didn't know what this building was." Now, that's not an uncommon statement. And sometimes I make a joke out of it. I'm not going to come here because everybody in the community knows who you are, but in the end times that Alan's been talking about,
Dennis
I'm
and I
going to
are
find the
go
first
hide
church.
out in the Adventist church.
They'll never find me. I have such a hard time finding Adventist churches, even on using Google. But the issue is that church now is getting to be known for being interested in their community. She also visited with her, the one that's in charge, Odell, that's in charge of the education committee. He's in her district from Long Beach, and she's been visiting in that office for close to 2 years now. And they've been partnering on a variety of different things, but Patty and their church decided they were going to do a Toys for Tots at Christmas time. So Patty had visited with the County Board of Supervisors, the LA County Board of Supervisors, and wanted to let them know about the wonderful things that the Adventist Church does, just to get to know them. The lady at the Super Board of Supervisor person was saying, "Well, that's the things that we do, so you don't need to do those things." So Patty said, "Well, who do you want, what kind of people, and who do you want your staff to get the names of the people that need help?" And that kind of took the lady back, apparently, but the lady did offer her $1,500 for turkeys. And she called me and I said no, and then I talked to Alan about it, so we're gonna have to have a rule now about whether or not we can accept money to help people. So that's a wonderful thing, but on the Toys for Tots Day, they didn't know how many people were gonna show up. Patty talked to the various different people that she'd been talking to in their offices. They sent out the emails to apparently lots of people, and they had 500 people that actually got into where the church was, and another 500 to 600 outside the church. And you know what the biggest giveaway that they had? It wasn't the toys, it wasn't any turkeys. They had a table set up and people took Bibles. So now that church in Long Beach has got another point of contact. And the pastors that are now having these kinds of things happening are now developing relationships with the elected officials' offices. Not necessarily the elected official, but the people who do the work, the staff members.
Makes a difference because oftentimes the members, whether it's city council members, supervisors at the state legislature, federal, on the Hill, they're always busy. And when people can develop the relationships with the staff, they have the ears of the members and the city elected officials, and that makes a difference. And so if I'm just going to jump in still a little bit longer, that's the role that we as lay people have. Imagine if all of us had the passion of Patty and what we could do in our sphere of how we can witness. That's what it's really all about. It doesn't take, the pastors aren't going to be able to do it all. The elders aren't going to be able to do it all. The union folk and the California or the conference office officials are not going to be able to do it all. We as lay people, and I'm a lay person, happen to be married to a pastor, but the pastors, no offense, they can't do it. We are called to also help and to witness wherever our touch point is as we develop and cultivate those relationships.
And the thing that's really morphing out of this thing that I think is important is it's helping the churches down there realize that not the brilliance of our founding fathers or our founders, but what God has done to set this church up in a way to meet the needs of the people in the communities. And so they're beginning to put the community services director together with the religious liberty director, and they're beginning to reach out, because if you have somebody being the door opener, the religious liberty person, and other persons that would want to do that, then that gives a lot of work for the rest of the officers or the offices in the local church to meet the needs of those people. But now we've talked about large numbers, and I'll be quiet, maybe. God also is interested in the little things. Congresswoman Berrigan, who is the first federal person, and I guess I have to confess this, Alan, I pled with Patty to only deal with the state people, because it might have helped me out a little bit more than it would have helped everyone else, but she didn't listen. She listened to God. She didn't listen to me. And so she talked to a variety of other people. But Congressman Berrigan's office contacted her and said, you know, we've been talking. We know that you guys do things. You've showed us about your community services. We have a constituent that has called us and said they only have enough money to buy adult diapers for half of the month. And they need help. And Patty called me and said, what do I do? I said, I don't know. You need to call your community service leaders in the varying churches around in your area down there who have food pantries and see what they have. She found somebody. They had they had the amount of adult diapers that this person needed for the remainder of the month. Patty picked them up, took them over there, and she said it was like Christmas because it was the right size, the right gender, and it just was the right everything. But the thing that was most fascinating to me about that, and it's odd that we would be talking at a religious liberty afternoon meeting about adult diapers, I guess, but, you know, God has a plan. But the thing that was so fascinating to me is that this particular food pantry had never, ever gotten any donations of adult diapers. But they did have them for this one time. And apparently it's an ongoing thing. And so God doesn't care whether there's one person, two people, or whether there's 1,000 people that are concerned about potholes in Compton. God is concerned about the little things and the difference that makes in people's life. And when we begin to partner not only with our elected officials, but our non-governmental groups in our communities, God is going to begin to open up something that can't be contained. We're not going to have to worry, in my opinion, about Christian nationalism if we're focused on meeting the needs of people in the community. And we're told that our communities will know who we are because we love one another. And this is one way where we can share that love. And I'm really happy that I have this job. Thanks, Alan.
So as you can see, our panel members are very passionate about this work, and there's a key theme in all of this. It's an avenue to witness. That's what it's all about. And I appreciate, Lincoln, the theme of this year's Liberty brochure, Witness, and that's what you talked about,
We
Janice.
have our poster woman here.
Exactly. So as you can
But
see,
it is the message we've been trying to get over for a long time. But for too many people, and I've got to be careful because Al and I meet with the PAL people and we talk about this and that case and defending Adventists, but for too long, I think that's the singular message we've been getting across to Adventists, that's sort of an insurance policy. My reading of religious liberty from the very beginning, it was a way to facilitate and enable and perpetuate our ability to reach out and speak to the times and the hope that we have to other people at the end of time.
I'm downright offended by the notion that what we're doing is an insurance policy. It is the gospel.
Yeah, I know, but you know what I mean.
No, I hate it when church leaders are like,
Oh,
yeah,
yes.
we'll support religious liberty so we have more time to preach the gospel. No, we are preaching the gospel.
That's right.
Because that's Christ giving
But
us
our
freedom.
campaign promotions for a long time, I think, have set us up for this misunderstanding because we told a great story on each occasion and it sort of perpetuates the idea. But we need people that are involved. This is part of the gospel. And I think that video was right on the mark. I wish I could say that I prepped her in detail. This was from the heart. And I hope that it communicates to our churches.
How much did you pay her?
Well,
I'm a
Just
layperson who
teasing.
God has blessed me to go when called, and that was with not even a penny. Amen.
can I throw
I'm
something
just
in?
teasing.
Really change the topic, but you know, I don't often get to listen, except at our PAL meetings, and that frustrates me, but I don't often get to hear Alan as I did last night and today. Very good evidence. And I was thinking that there's several legs on the stool of describing what's happening at the end of time. There's no question that there's great controversy, outlines in detail, picking up on Daniel and Revelation, that we can expect in this country, this Christian nationalism and ultimately coercion to a certain religious viewpoint. triumphalist American state. But that's part of it. And you read a few comments about Rome, but I believe that Rome's role is not insignificant, and it's been explained to us since 2015 in great detail. Rome has cast its lot in, I think, boots and all, to be the defender of the human race against environmental degradation. And the document Laudato Si is very, very plain. That for survival of humanity, we all need to get together, honor God, respect the rhythms, as the Pope says, rhythms inscribed in nature, represented by the seventh-day Sabbath, which they will apply on Sunday. And if you don't go along with that, you're an enemy of mankind. And ironically, at the moment, this dysfunctional administration in this country, with all of its warts and so on, is actually doing a good thing in being a flat earth party. They don't believe in global warming or anything of that nature. And that is a holdback to Rome's efforts to bring the whole world into one coalition. But I believe it's as simple as the next major disaster, as Ellen White says, continuing natural calamities. People will be saying this is God's punishment and we've got to worship God again to save ourselves. And at that point, I think it will come together. And to me, it's just, even if I didn't have prophecy, I'd say it's written in the wind. It's obvious that the papal system is determined, and they've got good biblical evidence anyhow, they've determined to make this the singular issue. I get letters from a lot of Adventists lately. For some reason, the meeting, I think it's in May, in Rome, has caught their attention. I wouldn't say that's greatly important more than some of the others, but it's a marker along the way to creating this global coalition. But at the moment, unless something extraordinary happens between now and May, this country's not going to be there. And as, with some justification, what's often said is that this is the indispensable nation, does apply.
Raise your hand. Pastor's got a. Do we have any more mics, Eli? No. Let me bring my mic over.
More energy or time for questions. Many of our church members are facing the traditional question. They are looking for a job, for employment, and they go to a manager and they put their application, and the manager asks, well, do you have any questions? And they would say, well, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist and I cannot work on Sabbath, Friday to Sunday. And they say, well, leave your application here, we'll call you. They never call him back. And they go to another job and they face the same story. It was actually the case of my wife. Providentially, she got a better job than in other place, but what's your wisdom in this? That's one question.
I am very glad you asked that question.
That's one question. I have another question.
One at a time.
The second, one at a time, okay.
Okay. No, I want to take your second question. Don't give the mic away, but let me just address this one first. So, any time now, California regulations will be finalized that will address this problem, and it's something I've been pushing for about 5 years.
At least. We were just whispering that you've been instrumental and you've been working hard on this. So I just want us to, I'm sorry, but we need to also continue to make sure we do affirm our leaders who are working hard, doing things we don't even know as lay people. But it's because of the acumen and the tenacity. So, yes. Amen.
Thank you for the shout out, Janice. So here's the thing. It has always been the law that employers cannot ask questions in the application process that would lead to them singling an applicant out on the basis of their protected class status. So what do I mean by protected class status? Race, gender, age, disability, religion, right? So employment applications for hourly wage positions typically will ask you about your availability. And if you don't indicate that you're available, whenever the company says jump and you say how high, then they're not interested in hiring you. And we ran into this even with part-time summer jobs for Target for high school kids, and they're only going to get 12 hours a week, but God forbid they can't work on Sabbath. We don't want you. So it's not illegal for a company to ask about availability, but it is if that's the basis for screening people out. Now, my stepson just turned 29 a couple of days ago, so this whole idea goes back to when he was about 16, and we're at the mall, and we're in PacSun, and I'm the one asking for summer job applications, and I see on this application where it says, can you perform the essential functions of the job with or without an accommodation? And I'm thinking, we need language like that for religious accommodation, right? So I've been pushing this now. We started working on regulations after the California Workplace Religious Freedom Act passed in 2012. So probably about 5 or 6 years. And we proposed this in the first round of amendments. And they said they would come back to it, and they did. And we have some very good language that should be finalized pretty soon. It will require job applications to tell applicants not to indicate if they are unavailable at certain times on account of religion, medical condition, or disability. Now, when people call me over the last 25 years about this issue, I say to them, you have no legal obligation to disclose. But they say, but what am I going to do if I'm asked? I can't lie about it. Well, by having this language in the application, it tells you this is what you're supposed to do, is not disclose it. Right? Does that make sense? So going forward, we hope that the implementation of this regulation is going to help a lot of job applicants. And it will apply also to online applications. Now, this morning I told you about one bill that we got done last year that was so critical. Another one we got done, speaking of online applications, and we had this case where, if you go to arbitration, you've lost your rights. Your right to a jury trial, your rights to appeal, your rights to having public, your claims being public. And companies are no longer allowed to require you to check off a box agreeing to arbitration as part of the job application, which is what they've been doing. We've been fighting against arbitration is hard because of the conservative courts. But anyway, your second question. Hopefully that helped with the first one.
Is this
I'll sit down now.
is this applicable on Indian reservation?
No.
Okay. All right. I have more questions, but I guess other people may have questions too.
No, go ahead.
Anybody else? Raise your hand. So just to piggyback what Alan has said, I always tell people when they apply, don't volunteer unless they ask you. If they ask you, you got to tell them until this law that he's working on gets passed. You're not lying, but it's in the job application problem where we have the biggest problem. Once they've accepted your application and they interview you and they've already guaranteed you the job, that's when they ask you, that's when you can tell them. But you don't have to tell them everything up front. But this new law is going to really help in that regard. Did somebody over here have a question?
I just want to say about what you were speaking of. Our church have what's called a dork. I named it Dorcas. They call it community service, but I always call it Dorcas. But anyway, So we have a Dorcas, and by God's grace, in the last couple of years, we've seen, we've been used to giving out food Tuesdays and Thursdays, but we have seen God doing something traumatic at that place. I mean, it's just unbelievable. We decided that, hey, Pastor Bohr had given us a lot of old, CDs, and we went and he says, take as many as you want. So we thought, hey, we should get a lot of those CDs and take them over to Dorcas and just put them on the counter, And so we put Great Controversies, we put out all kinds of books, Steps to Christ. And so in the last couple of years, it's just been amazing. It's like, I've never seen anything like it in my life. We can fill that counter, and before that day is over, and they would even come in and they would say, is this free? We say, sure, help yourself. And they're looking, they're talking to each other. Oh, I read that one. Oh, I've already seen that one. Oh, I read this one. And so they're going by all the ones they've read. And is this one free? Because I want to read this one. And one lady came in and said, I had this book, and somehow someone got a hold. I don't know if I laid it down, but someone got my book. Do you guys possibly have any more of those books? And we were trying to figure out which book, where it was Great Controversy. So when we found out, we thought, we didn't think we had any around. And I think Furman found a couple in the box, got impressed him, look in the box. And she was like, oh, thank you so much, because somebody got my book, and I was just so wanting to read that book. And then a lady came in a week ago, probably 2 weeks now, and she said, I just have to tell you, I am so fearful. And we said, what do you mean? She said, man, I have to learn more. Do you guys have anything about the fifth seal? She says, I am so excited I've been reading about the first and the second and third, and I want to know about what the fifth seal is. So, they get all excited, and they're telling us now, oh, yeah, and this is going to happen. They come in, they're kind of like preaching to us, telling us about the different events that are taking place. And so, if we had someone even to come there and show us even maybe different approaches or whatever, I don't know, but and showing that these people are really excited, and they're going out, they're telling other people, and we get a lot of people come in now for food, but I'm realizing that it's not, and we said, we're getting ready to start Bible studies, so instead of you waiting out here in line, you will be able to go and attend class doing, oh, really, when is that starting? So we got people already signing their names up for Bible studies, so praise the Lord, but, maybe you can give us ideas of what we can do even different. We got one day, I think Elaine, and they're going to have some nurses, and they're going to have a Tuesday for Bible studies, a Thursday for like outreach for maybe dealing with diabetes or any kind of health issues, guest speakers or whatever. So maybe you can tell us something we can do, that to even increase that.
Well, what comes to my mind is A, you're doing the mission that God has called you to do. And B, what also comes to my mind is on Ministry of Healing, page 143, where Ellen White, and I'm paraphrasing, but where Ellen White talks about Christ's method alone and how he mingled with the people, he toiled with the people, he won their confidence, and then he said, come follow me. And that's exactly what it is that you're doing, and that's a blessing to hear and see. And so keep it up, and just to see how it's now growing and how they're spreading the word and coming back on fire, letting you all know what they're reading because of the vision of putting out the books and the CDs. Keep it up. That's what it's about. And that's, again, going back to witnessing, that's how we're all able to witness in the spheres that we have been placed.
Mm-hmm. And all this praise goes to God.
I do
also
have
want
one
to
idea.
say that, as Seventh-day Adventists, sometimes we are wanting to reach out, but sometimes we forget, like you say, about reaching them where they are, trying to love them in, or just showing them you're concerned, really concerned. When I go out sometime to take the names, the people are lined up, and sometimes it's very cold, and I'll just stop and I'll say, good morning. I'll make make sure they understand we really want you here. And so, and they reply back. So now when we come out, it's like, oh, hi, good morning. I say, good morning, how's everyone? I mean, seriously meaning, how are you? So as one lady came up, and I was taking her name, and I noticed she was crying. So I stopped and I said, are you okay? And she said, and she covered her face. So I stopped what I was doing, and I just hugged her and just hugged with her for a while. And then I said, you okay? And she stopped crying. And then I got her name and everything. The next time I saw the lady come, I don't know what God did, but God did something. And we have no credit in that, but I wish she would tell us what he did. Because now she comes and it's a total different person. I mean, from her hair, and she's homeless, but she comes like she's been to the house of the king. She comes looking like a total different person, and I would love to know what God has done, because he's done something within the life of this lady. Her whole disposition has changed. When you talk to her, I just can't explain it, but you know God did something in that lady's life, because we prayed with her and whatnot.
I have one idea, and it kind of comes from the experience of my son's girlfriend. He's been seeing this young lady who was raised in a Filipino Roman Catholic home. And when they started seeing each other, I said to my wife, she'll make a good Adventist, because of course, Catholics, they're taught to love Jesus, but they don't really know very much, right? Well, she'd been coming to church for quite a long time, and then we got a new youth pastor, and the youth pastor eventually said to her, "Would you like to be baptized?" And her response was, "I've been waiting for somebody to ask me."
Wow, wow.
Okay, and so, he studied with her a little bit, and then we had a baptism there in the ocean, there in Malibu. I was supposed to help with it, but I got rolled by the waves. The surf was a little rough that day. I didn't think it was a great idea, and I love the ocean myself. But I wonder whether, let the Lord lead you, whether it should be a baptismal class that you conduct at the same time, or just putting some kind of card out, an invitation. Would you like to study for baptism? Join our church, whatever. But somehow, Jesus said, "You have not because you ask not." Right? So we just need to make it clear that option, that they really are, yes, we want to help take care of them, but we also want to welcome them into our family.
Well, this has been good. We're going to need to wrap up in the next few minutes, because some of these folks have long ways to get home this evening. So maybe we can take one or two more questions. Somebody that hasn't asked a question? Yeah, I'll get back to you if nobody else has a question. Anybody else? Those of you from another church, anybody else wants to make a comment or ask a question? If you make a comment, just make it very brief. This is not a time to tell a whole life story. But question over here, Abel. Sorry, I mispronounced your name. This is Pangan.
My name is Abel Pangan from the Central Valley. I'd like to ask a question regarding, LGBT. There was, I think, a few days ago, there was a bill that was passed on fairness to all. Would you please tell us more about that?
Well, so Fairness for All was introduced in Congress. It had a couple of Republican sponsors, no Democratic sponsors. So earlier last year, the Democrats in the House passed the Equality Act, which would extend broad protection for LGBT rights and no protection that would eliminate protection for religious liberty. Several years ago, Utah passed a bill that was a package of protections for LGBT rights and religious liberty both. And that's been working pretty well in Utah. And so there was an effort at the national level to work with some gay rights groups and some religious rights groups to come up with a bill that would answer the question, basically, how do we all have our rights respected and live together? It's a very difficult challenge because there are going to be conflicts between LGBT rights and religious freedom rights. So Fairness for All was named that way because it's an attempt to how can we maximize protections for everybody? How can you have your rights and we have our rights and live together in peace? One of the remarkable things about this bill, and at this point, you know, it's a total long shot, right? Because it has enemies on the left and the right. The far right doesn't want any recognition of LGBT rights at all, and the far left doesn't want the protections that are in there for religious liberty at all. And actually building any kind of meaningful coalition on the center, I mean, I've called the center the lonely middle forever. So it's a long shot, but it's certainly a statement of principle. And the remarkable thing is that the administration of Ted Wilson at the General Conference agreed that the Seventh-day Adventist Church can be a public sponsor of a measure that includes very broad protection for LGBT rights. So this is not, you know, this is a recognition of the reality. I think that the fact that, you know, we have our General Conference administration, nobody would ever accuse it of being liberal, I don't think. You know, it's a very conservative administration. And I think that this is an acknowledgement of where the genius of Adventism really is. That the genius of Adventism is not just about protecting our own rights, but it's about recognizing that people have the right to be different, to believe differently, to live differently, and that we have to figure out in society, how do we make that work for all of us, not just for those who believe the way we do. The fact that, you know, a conservative General Conference administration that very clearly upholds our traditional biblical values of human relationships, of marriage and sexuality, that they would agree to something like this. I think it's remarkable, but I do think it reflects the genius of Adventism.
I might just add that this proposed legislation has nothing to do with marriage. It would provide non-discrimination in employment and housing for the LGBT community. So it's just been introduced, and another problem that this bill faces, right now there's no Democratic sponsors that have signed on, co-sponsors that have signed on to the bill. It's been introduced by a legislator in Utah, and we're going to be meeting in Utah and Salt Lake later on in February to have a rally, and we're going to meet with that sponsor of the bill. I forget his name. Pastor has one more question. This will be the last question.
Can Loma Linda University fire a teacher that comes out as being gay? Practicing gay?
Can Loma Linda University?
Yes, without getting into legal battles.
Yes.
They can,
Yes.
because at this point they don't do it.
Whether they should or not, you know, is another matter, but they certainly have that right.
Fire someone last year to fire a teacher not adhering to it.
Well, okay, so, I mean, at La Sierra, I have understood that they built a internal set of policies that makes it very difficult to fire a teacher under their own policies. And I don't know what the similar policies are at Loma Linda. But as a matter of, you know, the state law, is somebody going to have recourse to filing at the state level? No. But that protection, by the way, is, you know, is tenuous. And frankly, the fact that the legislature is dealing with big issues like homelessness and sexual harassment is taking the heat off the church.
So I want to thank everybody for coming this afternoon. There's so much more we could share, but we don't want to wear out the patience of the saints. As you can see, there's a lot happening, and we'll keep you posted as the year goes on. We're going to see a lot more amazing things happen in the next few years, so just hold on to your seats. Be alert, read, and keep informed about what's taking place, and pray. And the other thing is get involved, get to know people in your community. Do stuff to help other people, not just Bible studies, but help people in a practical way, like Deborah was saying, outreach to the homeless and other things. That's part of our mission. Remember what Jesus is going to, this is a big thing of Alan, I'll let him have the last word about Matthew 25. What is Jesus going to ask us in the judgment? Is he going to say, did you keep my Sabbath faithfully? Did you pay your tithe? What's the answer? Did you do it unto one of the least of my, and what did that involve? Ministering to the needs of the people, right? Exactly. So to show justice and mercy and to help people in need, that's how we share the gospel with people. And the Lord will open doors when we meet their felt needs, and they'll be more concerned about their spiritual needs. Well, thank you for coming. Let's stand and have a closing prayer. And I'm going to ask Lincoln if he would close with prayer.
Thinking about religious liberty again, which is so important. And I thank you that even though there are competing interests, competing meetings often, that so many have come here today. And I pray that in this area, and in this conference, and in this union, and indeed in our whole division, and through to the world, that Adventism context, that we can make a difference, that we can speak liberty throughout the land, and we can show people that we're not just people that meet in a cloistered environment, that we're part of the community, and we're working to develop that community of nations for eternity in your kingdom. This is my prayer for Jesus' sake. Amen.